This all happened when I was babysitting for the Millers. They're a really nice family with 2 kids, Emma, who's 6, and Liam, who's 4. I've known them for a couple of years, and I'd been babysitting for them regularly. The kids are sweet and well-behaved, so it's usually an easy and enjoyable job. I never expected anything like what happened that night. It was a Friday evening, and I arrived at the Millers' house around 5 p.m., just as Mrs. Miller was finishing getting ready for a night out with her husband. She gave me the usual rundown. Dinner was already prepared. The kids could watch a movie after eating, and bedtime was around 8 p.m. Pretty standard stuff. After they left, I set about making the evening as fun as possible for Emma and Liam. We had dinner together, mac and cheese, which is their favorite, and then they asked if they could watch a new animated movie that had just come out. I put on the movie, and we all settled down in the living room. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the kids giggling at the screen, and I remember feeling relaxed, even a bit sleepy, as I sat on the couch. Around 7 p.m., just as the movie was hitting its stride, the doorbell rang. It startled me because the Millers hadn't mentioned anyone coming over, and I wasn't expecting any deliveries. For a moment, I thought it might be one of their neighbors, but something about the timing seemed odd. I told the kids to stay in the living room while I went to answer the door. When I got to the front door, I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing on the porch. He was holding a medium-sized package and wearing what looked like a delivery uniform, a navy shirt, khaki pants, and a baseball cap with some sort of logo on it. At first glance, he seemed like your typical delivery guy, but the longer I looked, the more something felt off. His posture was too stiff, and instead of standing squarely in front of the door, he was positioned slightly to the side, almost like he was trying to stay out of full view. His eyes were shifting around, not just glancing, but scanning the area around him, and every few seconds, he'd glance over his shoulder as if he was expecting someone, or maybe making sure no one else was watching. I hesitated before opening the door, a little voice in my head telling me something wasn't right. But I didn't want to be rude or overthink it, so I cracked the door open, leaving the chain on, and asked how I could help. "Package for the Millers," he said, his voice smooth and casual. But there was a slight edge to it, almost like he was forcing the friendliness. "You need to sign for it." That was my first real red flag. The Millers never had me sign for packages. I've taken in deliveries for them before, and they always told me to just leave it on the porch if they weren't home. I started to tell him that he could leave the package outside, but then he did something that set off alarm bells. As I was talking, his gaze shifted past me into the house, quickly scanning the entryway and the hallway beyond. It was almost like he wasn't even listening to me, more interested in what was behind me than in what I was saying. I could see his eyes darting from one side of the room to the other, taking in the layout, probably noting if there was anyone else around. "I just need a signature," he repeated, pushing the clipboard a little closer to me. There was a slight tremor in his hand, and his smile, which I now realized was plastered on, didn't reach his eyes. At this point, my gut was screaming at me to just close the door and forget about it. But I didn't want to make a scene or act paranoid, so I reluctantly reached out, took the clipboard, and signed a quick, messy version of my name. The whole time, I kept my eyes on him, trying to figure out what exactly was making me feel so uneasy. When I handed the clipboard back, he hesitated for a moment before finally handing me the package. As he did, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His fingers were trembling. It was subtle, but there was definitely a shake in his hand as he passed the box over to me. I took it, and he quickly stepped back, giving me a quick nod before turning and walking away. But as he left, I saw him glance back at the house over his shoulder just for a split second. I stood there for a moment, the door still partially open, watching him walk down the driveway. The uneasy feeling in my gut was growing stronger by the second. The whole interaction felt off, like a scene from a movie where you just know something bad is about to happen. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. The package in my hands felt oddly light, much lighter than I expected. I walked over to the table in the hallway and set it down, staring at it as if it might offer some explanation for the weird encounter I'd just had. After a few moments, I decided to open it. I figured maybe it was just a mistake, or perhaps the Millers had ordered something small that didn't weigh much. But when I tore open the box, all I found inside was crumpled newspaper. No receipt, no packing slip, no product, just a few sheets of old, wrinkled newspaper. My heart began to race as the realization hit me. That man hadn't been a real delivery person. He hadn't been there to drop off a package. He had been scoping out the house, and like an idiot, I had given him exactly what he wanted: a chance to look inside, to see who was home, and to assess how easy it would be to break in. Panic started to set in, and I immediately grabbed my phone and called Mrs. Miller. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened, but I could hear the fear creeping in. She was shocked and told me to hang up and call the police, which I did without hesitation. The police arrived within minutes, and I was so relieved to see them. 2 officers came inside while another circled the house, checking the perimeter. They asked me to describe the man and the interaction in as much detail as possible, which I did. They were professional and calm, but I could tell they were concerned. They explained that there had been a few reports of suspicious activity in the area, including someone posing as a delivery driver to gain access to homes. The officers took the empty package and the newspaper as evidence and assured me they would patrol the neighborhood more frequently over the next few days. They also advised me to stay vigilant and to call them immediately if I noticed anything unusual. After they left, I tried to go back to my usual babysitting routine, but I was on edge for the rest of the night. Every noise, every creak in the house made me jump. I kept checking on Emma and Liam, making sure they were safe and sound in their beds, and I double-checked every lock on every door and window. When the Millers came home later that night, I told them everything that had happened. They were understandably shaken, but incredibly grateful that I had acted quickly and called the police. They promised to install a security system the very next day, and Mrs. Miller even mentioned that they would be more careful about who they allowed near their home. The days that followed were tense. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to a potentially dangerous situation. The man hadn't broken in that night, but I knew that if I hadn't been cautious, things could have gone very differently. The police kept an eye on the neighborhood, and a week later, they caught someone matching the description I had given them trying to break into a house a few blocks away. It was a relief to know he was caught, but it didn't erase the fear I had felt that night. Now, whenever I babysit, I'm much more cautious. I don't open the door for anyone I don't know, and I'm always aware of my surroundings. That night at the Millers was a wake-up call, a reminder that even in a safe neighborhood, you can never be too careful. I was about 17 at the time and had been babysitting for a family in my neighborhood for a little over a year. They had a 3-year-old son named Ethan, who was one of the sweetest kids I'd ever met. His parents were great too, always kind and trusting, which made the job feel more like helping out friends than working. One afternoon, the Millers, I'm using a different name for privacy reasons, asked me to pick Ethan up from daycare and bring him home since they were both stuck at work. I'd done this a few times before, so it was nothing out of the ordinary. I drove a small, older car, nothing fancy, but reliable enough to get me around town. The daycare was about 15 minutes from their house, and I knew the route by heart. After picking Ethan up, we headed back toward his house. Ethan was in the back seat, happily chatting away about his day. We were about 5 minutes from the house when I realized I needed to stop for gas. I pulled into a small gas station that I'd been to many times before. It was in a relatively quiet area, and I didn't think twice about it. I got out, swiped my card at the pump, and started fueling up. I could see Ethan in the back seat, still playing with his toy car, completely oblivious to anything else. As I stood there, I noticed a man walking across the parking lot toward the station. He looked a little rough around the edges. disheveled clothes, unkempt hair, but again, I didn't think much of it. People came and went from the gas station all the time. Just as I finished pumping gas and was about to put the nozzle back, the man suddenly appeared next to me. Before I could react, he shoved me hard against the car, knocking the wind out of me. I hit my head pretty hard on the pump wall and fell for a split second. My mind went blank with shock as I realized what was happening. He wasn't after my wallet or phone. He wanted the car. Everything happened so fast. The man grabbed the keys out of my hand, and before I could even scream, he jumped into the driver's seat. My heart stopped when I saw him turn and look at Ethan in the back seat. I could see the confusion on Ethan's face, but he wasn't crying. He didn't understand what was happening. "Get out!" I shouted, trying to pull the door open, but the man had already locked it. My hands were shaking as I pounded on the window, begging him to let Ethan go. But he didn't even glance my way. Instead, he threw the car into reverse, backed out of the parking spot, and sped off, leaving me standing there in utter shock. For a split second, I was paralyzed, unable to process what had just happened. Then the panic set in. I screamed for help, but there was no one else around. I grabbed my phone from my pocket and called 911, trying to stay calm enough to give the operator the details. I told them everything, the make and model of the car, the direction he was heading, and most importantly, that a child was in the back seat. The operator assured me that police were on the way, but every second that passed felt like an eternity. I was terrified. Terrified for Ethan and what that man might do. I couldn't stop thinking about his innocent face, how he must have been so confused and scared. I couldn't just stand there waiting for the police, so I ran inside the gas station and begged the clerk to help me. He was an older man, and though he seemed as shocked as I was, he quickly pulled up the security footage to see if we could spot anything useful. We watched the footage together, and sure enough, we saw the man approach me, shove me, and then take off with the car. But the footage didn't show anything that could help us identify him. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the police arrived. They took my statement and immediately put out an alert for the car. I kept asking if they'd found anything, if they'd found Ethan, but all they could do was assure me they were doing everything they could. I'll never forget the helplessness I felt in those moments. It's one thing to be scared for yourself, but to be responsible for someone else, especially a child, is a whole different level of fear. I kept picturing Ethan's face, imagining the worst, and it made me feel like I was going to be sick. After what felt like an eternity, I got a call from one of the officers. They had spotted the car abandoned on the side of the road a few miles away. My heart was in my throat as they told me they were sending units to check it out. I could barely breathe just waiting for them to tell me what they'd found. Finally, the call came. Ethan was safe. The man had taken the car and driven it a short distance before ditching it. When the officers found Ethan, he was still sitting in his car seat, unharmed but understandably scared. They told me he'd been crying for me, and it broke my heart all over again. I wanted nothing more than to hold him and make sure he was okay. The police brought Ethan back to the gas station, and when I saw him, I burst into tears. He was shaken but physically unharmed, and when he saw me, he reached out, calling my name. I hugged him so tightly, not wanting to let go. The police were amazing. They gave us space to reunite, and then gently asked Ethan a few questions to see if he could tell them anything about the man. But Ethan was too young to understand what had happened, and he didn't have much to offer them. As for the man, the police didn't catch him right away. They searched the area but found no trace of him. It was as if he'd vanished after abandoning the car. They assured me they'd continue to investigate, but weeks went by without any new leads. The Millers were, of course, horrified by what had happened, but they didn't blame me. They were just grateful that Ethan was safe. The whole experience changed me. I went from being a carefree teenager to someone who was constantly looking over my shoulder. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if things had gone differently, if that man had taken off with Ethan and hadn't left him unharmed. The thought still haunts me. Eventually, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like that. But I was never the same. Even now, years later, I'm extra cautious about everything. I never let my guard down, and I'm always aware of my surroundings. It's a lesson I wish I hadn't had to learn in such a terrifying way, but it's one I'll never forget. I hope my story can serve as a warning to others to stay vigilant, especially when children are involved. You never know what might happen, even in the most mundane situations. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this. I hope it helps keep others safe. I was about 10 years old at the time, and my parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with a babysitter. It was a rainy night, the kind where the sound of the rain against the windows makes everything feel a little more isolated. I was in the living room, playing with my toys, while the babysitter was in the kitchen, probably on her phone. I glanced out the window, watching the rain pour down, when something caught my eye. There, standing near the trees at the edge of the backyard, was a man. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figure was just standing there, barely visible through the sheets of rain. He wasn't moving, just staring straight at the house. I froze, not sure what to do. I could see him clearly, and the longer I looked, the more certain I was that he was watching me. I rushed to the kitchen to tell my babysitter. "There's a man outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her phone, clearly not believing me. "Don't be silly," she said, brushing it off as a child's imagination. "It's just the rain. You probably saw a shadow." But I knew what I saw. I insisted that she come and look, and after some coaxing, she finally followed me back to the living room. I pointed out the window, my heart sinking as I realized the man was still there. The babysitter squinted through the rain, and I could see her expression change as she spotted him too. "Oh my God," she whispered, her casual demeanor disappearing instantly. Before she could react, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. The storm had knocked out the power, leaving us in total blackness. I could hear the rain pounding against the windows, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The babysitter tried to turn on her phone's flashlight, but the battery was low, and the light barely cut through the darkness. I stood there, gripping the edge of the couch, when a flash of lightning illuminated the backyard for a brief second. That's when I saw him again, closer this time. He had moved closer to the house, and he was looking right at us. I don't think I'll ever forget his face. There was something off about it, something that made my stomach twist. His eyes were cold, and he had a long, scraggly beard that was dripping with rain. That's when I realized he had seen me too. Panic set in, and I knew we had to act fast. I bolted towards the staircase, shouting at the babysitter to follow me. We needed to make sure all the doors were locked before he tried to get inside. We rushed through the house, checking the front door first. It was locked, but I still pushed a chair against it, wedging it under the handle. The babysitter ran to the back door, and I could hear her fumbling with the lock. The sound of her trying to secure it was the only thing breaking the silence, apart from the rain. As I ran to join her, I heard a loud thud. The man was at the back door, trying to force it open. I froze, standing just a few feet away as I saw the door shake with each hit. The babysitter was standing right in front of it, her hands trembling as she tried to hold it shut. I grabbed another chair and shoved it under the door handle, just like I had done with the front door. We both stood there, staring at the door as he continued to bang on it, trying to break in. The force of his blows was terrifying, and with each hit, the door seemed like it might give way. The only thing holding it was the flimsy lock and the chair wedged against it. I stood there, gripping the edge of the couch, when a flash of lightning illuminated the backyard for a brief second. That's when I saw him again, closer this time. He had moved closer to the house, and he was looking right at us. I don't think I'll ever forget his face. There was something off about it, something that made my stomach twist. His eyes were cold, and he had a long, scraggly beard that was dripping with rain. That's when I realized he had seen me too. Panic set in, and I knew we had to act fast. I bolted towards the staircase, shouting at the babysitter to follow me. We needed to make sure all the doors were locked before he tried to get inside. We rushed through the house, checking the front door first. It was locked, but I still pushed a chair against it, wedging it under the handle. The babysitter ran to the back door, and I could hear her fumbling with the lock. The sound of her trying to secure it was the only thing breaking the silence, apart from the rain. As I ran to join her, I heard a loud thud. The man was at the back door, trying to force it open. I froze, standing just a few feet away as I saw the door shake with each hit. The babysitter was standing right in front of it, her hands trembling as she tried to hold it shut. I grabbed another chair and shoved it under the door handle, just like I had done with the front door. We both stood there, staring at the door as he continued to bang on it, trying to break in. The force of his blows was terrifying, and with each hit, the door seemed like it might give way. The only thing holding it was the flimsy lock and the chair wedged against it. The babysitter and I exchanged a glance, both of us realizing how serious the situation had become. We were trapped, unable to call for help because the power was out and the phone lines were down. My phone was upstairs, but even if I could get to it, I doubted I'd have any signal in the storm. As the man continued to try and break in, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. We stood there, not daring to move, waiting to see what he would do next. I slowly approached the window next to the door, trying to see if he was still outside. The rain made it hard to see anything, but after a few moments, I saw movement. He was backing away from the door, his eyes still fixed on the house. For a moment, I thought he might try another way in, but then he just turned and walked back toward the trees. We watched him disappear into the darkness, his figure swallowed up by the night. The babysitter and I didn't move for a long time, both of us too scared to believe that he was really gone. When we finally felt safe enough to breathe, the power flickered back on, flooding the house with light. The babysitter quickly called the police, who arrived not long after. They searched the area, but didn't find anyone. The man had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the fear he had instilled in us. They assured us they would patrol the neighborhood, but we both knew he was long gone. That night stayed with me for a long time. The image of that man, standing in the rain with that unsettling look on his face, is something I'll never forget. It's made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, especially at night.